goes a little something like.
Hello, Literates. I'm Britt Riley, and welcome back to Writer's Ambition. For those of you who've been hanging in since episode 1, you're the real one. And for those of you who are just finding my humble channel, welcome. We hope you stay a while. Okay, so we have been talking about love for the past 3 weeks. And I'm not over it, but we did that and we're done. So we are going to scooch on to episode 2 of my new series Within the Discourse. And today, in the spirit of Black History Month, and everyone's talking about resistance and, singing our greats and they deserve to be sung, we are going to talk about a book that I really love, called The Sovereignty of Quiet Beyond Black Resistance, or Beyond Resistance and Black Culture. And it's by Kevin Quashie. Professor Quashie teaches English, or Dr. Quashie is a professor of English at Brown University. So it is this I like this book a lot. This is his, I believe, second book. This is the second book. His first book is on Black women's subjectivity. I really like Sovereignty of Quiet because I think I read it in college for the first time, and then I picked it back up in grad school. And I still love it as much as I loved it in undergrad. I loved it in undergrad because it was a very easy read. Like, it wasn't so deep in theory that I couldn't understand what he was saying. I loved it for that reason. And in graduate school, I love it because I'm like, it's one of those books where I read it and I'm like, yeah, right? Like, that's wild. And so we're going to be talking today about Black privacy. But we're going to start our conversation on Black privacy with his conversation on Beyond Resistance and Black Culture. Okay. And you should definitely read this book. Like I said, it's a very easy one. I know it's not like Hood Feminism or Eloquent Rage. Fine books. I love Eloquent Rage personally. I think it's amazing. So it's not like those books, How to Talk About Race Stamps. Like, it's not those books that we're hearing a lot of be pushed from Black studies or critical race studies, but this is a really, really good book and you should read it. Okay, so I almost said as always, this is only the second one, so there is no always because there's no precedent, but as I hope to do always, we're going to start not with my own like blah blah blah, but about where the discourse starts, and then we will pull back and apply it to our own conversation. But we're going to start with where Professor Quashie starts, and that is with quiet. So to start with his thesis on what this book is intending to do, literally very explicitly says, this book explores what a concept of quiet could mean to how we think about Black culture. The exploration is a shift in how we commonly understand Blackness, which is often described as expressive, dramatic, or loud. These qualities inherently reflect the equivalence between resistance and Blackness. Resistance is, in fact, the dominant expectation we have of Black culture. Sorry, I had a note written and I was like, is that a comma or an S? Okay. Resistance is, in fact, the dominant expectation we have of Black culture. Indeed, this expectation is so widely familiar that it does not require explanation or qualification. It is practically unconscious. Wow. I love this book. So I just read it to you. I'm not going to, I don't want to, I think that was very clearly and beautifully stated. But for those of you who are not audio learners and so are like, yeah, I heard it, but it's hard for me to like process things when they're read. Essentially what he is saying is we equate Blackness with resistance. we equate it so much with resistance that it is they're practically interchangeable terms. That there's an expectation of publicness for blackness and Black people. And he gives an example of it that I think is amazing. And he does it by reading an image. I hope that you can see this even though it's reversed. I feel like you should be able to see it regardless. This is an iconic photo. It is a photo of the 1968 Olympics. This is Tommie Smith in the center, John Carlos to his, I don't know what that would be for y'all. But in the picture, it's his right? No, it's his left. Me and mirror images. To his left is John Carlos, and then to his right is Peter Norman. And they're, of course, giving the Black Power salute. And if we really want to get into like reading the grammar of this picture, we could call their fists a punctuation of sorts. And I think that Professor Quashie gives that reading of their fists punctuating the air. We're not gonna take it that far, because that's not what we're here for. But that is a beautiful and profound reading of the picture, or of the photograph, rather. What I want to draw our attention to is another aspect that Professor Quashie centers, and that is the quiet of this image. So you have both of their, and by both I mean Smith and Carlos, their heads bowed. And Smith is even closing his eyes. You can see that Carlos's eyes are open. But Smith's eyes are closed, head bowed. It's a prayerful posture, and we know this. Or those of us who have experience in church or religious settings, we recognize that posture of the bowed head and the closed eyes. It's reflective, it's prayerful, it's meditative. We recognize this. What Professor Quashie says is that this image is iconic, whether you know it or not. This image is iconic, and it gets pushed as like, oh my gosh, like these athletes at the top of their game, they win, and they take this time to give a salute to Black Power, and all the resistance and all the statement, like what is known and said of this image is how loud it is, which is strange because they are perfectly quiet, right? Like vocally and in posture, there is a quiescence about this photo, but that does not prevail in the reading of this, in the mainstream reading of this photo. It's like as if they're doing something very, very loud and dramatic and expressive, all the things, right, that Professor Quashie says in his thesis, that what is expected of Blackness as public is what is read onto this photo, is what is read onto this moment. And they suffered greatly when they returned home. There were death threats. They could not get jobs. I think their medals might have even gotten revoked. Like, they suffered a lot of consequences, because we don't talk about that either. But this photo is an example of quiet. And if we read beyond the photo, it is even an example of consequence, and how quietness, even though it attempts to preserve psychic space, and if you watched the first episode of Within the Discourse with Respectability, you know psychic space comes from Darlene Clark Hines, Professor Darlene Clark Hines, a historian. A historian of the Black experience in America, or Black experiences in America. You recognize that from her essay on rape in the inner lives of Black women in the Middle West. Even when there attempts to be quiet in psychic space to protect, the public expectation of Blackness can be read onto that and can completely disregard any attempts at privacy. Right, that is what this photo and beyond, and the moments beyond the photo show us. So now let's fall back into the discourse. Professor Quashie, and we're not going to talk about the entire book. We never do. never the first time or the second time. We don't. We just talk about the thesis and the explanation so that we can be responsible when we have our own conversation. But it is worth noting that in expounding upon his theorization of quiet, Professor Kwashi does indeed go through Darlene Clark Hines' again discourse. He goes through Darlene Clark Hines' that very essay, Rape in the Inner Lives of Black Women in the Middle West. He quotes her, and it's worth seeing, because we're talking about Within the Discourse, it's worth seeing how he engages her to further his point. So he talks about Du Bois's double consciousness. We're not going to go there. But he says Du Bois's double consciousness is similar to Darlene Clark Hines' notion of dissemblance, while Hine coined, which Hine coined to characterize Black women's ambivalent relationship to public exposure. For those of you who were not here in Respectability, that he's offering her definition of dissemblance. Black women's ambivalent relationship to public exposure. Hine argues that in response to how they were negatively constructed in the social imagination as racial, gendered, and classed subjects, quote, Black women as a rule developed and adhered to a cult of secrecy, a culture of dissemblance, to protect the sanctity of inner aspects of their lives, if that's psychic space. The dynamics of dissemblance involved creating the appearance of disclosure or openness about themselves and their feelings while actually remaining an enigma, end quote. She goes on to assert that, quote, in the face of pervasive stereotypes, it was imperative that they collectively create alternative self-images, end quote. And then Kwashi ends by saying such use of duplicity as a politic of resistance has been well documented by Hine and others. And again, in Respectability, we talked about that, because Respectability has a lot to do with attempting to reclaim and remake the narrative of Black subjects in America and to protect the inner lives and to create some psychic space between the expectation of publicness. So Kwashi is still in that discourse of respectability, not in terms of respectability, but in that discourse, and he's absolutely thinking of Higginbotham. Because he's thinking of Hines. It's really difficult to separate those two concepts because they are in conversation with each other. But that just goes back to respectability is a continuum, and it's not some stagnant choreography of propriety. It's about representation, and so is this, right? Because the expectation of publicness means that one is always accountable to respond and to resist, and the expectation that resistance is going to be dramatic and loud, and that is not what Tommy Smith and John Carlos did, but they still suffered consequences as if it was. And I thought it very appropriate to start with acknowledging that Black people are expected to exist very publicly and then hyper visibly, and that it's inappropriate, and that's a really mild term. I could just straight up call it racist. Pick your word on what you can, how much truth you can handle today. At the very least, it's inappropriate. At the very most honest of it, it's racist, and here's why I say that. The expectation that Black people constantly be in resistance is to imply that Black people and that Blackness only exist in relationship to trauma and to the racial terror that is whiteness, which attempts to stunt or deny or erase the capacity of Blackness, which includes quiet. And that's what Professor Kwashi is saying. So how can we gather that into a conversation that we are partaking in? Because that quiet gets me to Black privacy. And I'm thinking about that in a very, very particular instance on BookTuber that I wasn't even here for. I was just watching. I hadn't even started my channel yet. I'm talking about Black privacy for Black creators on this platform. I'm thinking about summer 2020 when in the deaths of the murders, the state-sanctioned murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And back in the summer when this was still all anyone was talking about, and it was bizarre. And it wasn't bizarre because people were talking about it. People always talk about it. It was bizarre because people were giving energy as if this time was going to be different than all the others, and it was bizarre to me for that reason alone. Like, it seemed a bit naive to me. Like, because the people that were saying it, I was just looking at them and I was like, are you unaware of how common this is? Or does something, or are you aware of how common this is and something about this is just smacking different for you? And if so, what is it? But I wasn't really getting the latter. That's very generous. It was really giving the former of people just being completely oblivious to the issue. Anyway, I digress. I saw several Black creators come on their channel and speak out and call out white creators for not using that platform to call attention to the issue, call out racist issues in the bookish community, and uplift organizations that are battling the issues. I have no problem with the call outs, to be clear. What I wonder is if they being the Black creators, not the white creators they were calling out, I wonder if the Black creators felt indebted to do that, to come on their platform because they were Black, or if they felt comfortable resting in their own space, not making a statement publicly, and mourning as Black people always are when we are forced to reconfront the precarity of Black life in America. That was very well said, and I thought it out before I said it. And here's what I mean. I wonder if those creators who came on their platform, particularly creators that dropped a tear, which I have no problems with. Like, be on your channel in whatever way you want to. I wonder if they felt pressed and to do that rather than to cry tears that we all cried in the privacy of our own homes, or if they felt like because they were Black and a Black man was killed again and a Black woman was killed again, if we had to be the ones to bring in the resistance or it wasn't going to happen. And if they were responding to a very felt expectation that Black people be the one to lead the charge against racial injustice, as if it is our problem, our cross to bear, and our default, that resistance is our default, and that we are not owed quiet and privacy, or that we don't want it. I wonder. And I also wonder if I would have said something if I was on this platform. I don't know. But I do know that when that happened, I was in bed for like a solid week. I didn't even look at my front door. Like, because it is very exhausting to always be in mourning, y'all. It's really, really tiring. And I don't know, but I would hate to think that Black creators on this platform feel pressed to perform lamentation because that's what they feel is expected of them. Now, whether they do or whether they don't, I don't have any flack for them either way, because if they do, I understand why. And if they don't, congratulations for ignoring the pressure. But I think it is worth saying and worth being aware of the fact that when racial stuff pops off, people expect black creators to say something, and then everyone else opts in or opts out, and you just hope that you don't get called out for your choice. But I don't want to use problematic. And I don't want to use problematic, and I don't really even have a statement to make. This is just to open the conversation on Black privacy and to say that there absolutely is an expectation that Black people, which includes Black creators, have a very public expression of resistance. And it can be as quiet as Shelby and Carlos, and it can be beyond that. It can be you don't have to say anything. Like you don't have to say anything at all on a public platform. And that's really it. That there's an expectation that weighs heavily on Black people that we need to begin to interrogate, because it has everything to do with what we always talk about on this channel, which is representation. And how people are represented is how they're treated. Let me say that again for people in the back. And also cite a Black woman, because that's what we do on this channel. Sweeney D. Madison, who's a performance ethnographer, says, and I think she said it in what, her third book? I don't remember. If I can find it, I'll put it here. If I can't, I'm still just telling you that she is the one who said this. Sweeney D. Madison, a performance studies professor. She's also a performance ethnographer. She writes, how people are represented is how they are treated. That is why it's important to talk about Black privacy. That's why it's important to talk about respectability. That's why it's important to talk about all the books, all the essays, all the ideas that we're going to talk about in this series Within the Discourse, because how people are represented is how they're treated. And if we don't begin to interrogate that, then it's difficult to be responsible to something that you were not thoroughly aware of. And this is the beginning of how to become aware. It's also just a monthly recommendation of some really great books and Black critical theory that you can read. And these books are relatively easy. This book is definitely a super easy and small read, and I don't mean easy as far as like the content. I mean just like the way it's expressed is easy to understand. The argument is heavy hitting and profound. So that's all for this installment of Within the Discourse, talking about Black privacy. I encourage you to read this book, Beyond the Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance and Black Culture by Kevin Quashie. It's an amazing read. Let me know if you do end up reading it. If you're TBRing it, let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. That's all the prompt I can really think of, y'all. Talking about Black privacy just makes me so tired, because it blows my mind consistently how much Black people are assumed not to need privacy. It's difficult to state to a mixed company audience how exhausting it is sometimes to be in this country and deal with the foolishness, and then have a platform where people expect you to always be speaking on it, which is not what I'm doing. Like, oh, I feel pressure to speak on, so I'm doing this series. That's not it. But to know there's an expectation that when certain things pop off and your mental health is at its most fraught, you're expected to speak through those emotions, to guide someone else who is at the beginning of a racial awakening. It's exhausting and infuriating. But the only way for me to end this frustration is to simply stop this video. So let me do that. Thank you so much for watching. If you think that someone would enjoy this video, give it a share. Drop down in the comments. If you don't have anything to say, you can simply leave a Black heart. We accept those over here. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you next month, okay? Bye-bye.